I used to go through the Santa Barbara newspapers of 100 years ago and pick out the best stories of the year and put them into a book. My books were called Way Back When. The first one was for 1914 and 1919 was the last one. I call them The History of Santa Barbara, 1 year at a time. My 1917 book was in the bookstores in December 2017 when the Thomas Fire broke out. As I watched the news of the fire, I was reminded of the big fires of 1917 that happened in our area exactly 100 years earlier. There are 4 pages in the book about the 1917 fires. So I'll start with the fires of that year and then compare them with the firefighting methods and the resources they had 100 years ago with what we had for the Thomas Fire. It was a momentous year, even before the fire started. The United States had just entered World War I. But we tried to maintain some sense of normality. Over at the Santa Barbara High School, the senior class performed their class play. And out on the Channel Islands, the Flying A Film Studio was making yet another mermaid movie. Any excuse for skimpy costumes. Remember, it's art. Lack of rainfall was not a problem in 1917. We'd had several years of above average rainfall, starting with the Great Flood of 1914 that I covered in my book of that year. In general, we average about 18 inches of rain a year, but in 1914, we had more than 30. 1915, 16, and 17 were all wet years. But as you know, rainfall makes plants grow, so this meant we had a lot of vegetation. Here's a quote from a recent book about the importance of the 1917 fires. I'll read it. This reputation for conflagrations probably began in 1917, when on June 15, the Carpinteria and Wheeler Springs fires broke out on the same day. The Carpinteria fire burned 20,000 acres, while the Wheeler Springs fire blackened 28,420 acres and destroyed most of the town of Ojai. But in mid-June of 1917, the record-breaking heat wave and hot winds caught everyone's attention. This is the official record of the US Weather Bureau. You've heard the expression, off the charts? Well, this is what it looks like. The top line of the chart is 100 degrees Fahrenheit. On June 15, the temperature hit 105. Then on June 17, we got hit with 115 degrees, and that was the temperature in Santa Barbara near the coast. I'll talk about the inland areas in a minute. And by the way, all of the headlines that I'm showing here are actual headlines from the newspapers, many of them from Santa Barbara. And also remember, this was back in the days before air conditioning. If you were lucky, you had an electric fan. If not, you could pay a nickel and ride on the streetcar to get a little breeze, or in your car. Or you could get out your Armstrong fan and drink homemade lemonade. Or you could head to the local soda fountain. But that was it. The local paper said that hundreds of people in Santa Barbara gathered their kids and towels and slept on the beach that night. Up in Ojai, it was even hotter. At a barbecue there, the paper reported, instead of using fire as a means for cooking meat, large flat stones heated in the sun will furnish the heat. The stones became intensely hot, cooking the meat in a few minutes. I didn't read about anybody frying an egg on the sidewalk, but I'm sure that was a possibility. Newspapers back then often mentioned an anonymous person referred to as the oldest inhabitant and asked whether he or she remembered similar events. This quote is one of the few references I found to the fact that hot winds were a contributing factor as well as high temperature. And I'll read it. In the memory of the oldest inhabitant, no such freak of weather as that recently visiting Santa Barbara, in common with all other California points, can be remembered. The hot waves came in intervals and in spots, like a breath from an oven door, causing the mercury to jump 30 degrees in 2 minutes. There were so many fires at this time, I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out what was going on where and how to organize all the information. As I was racking my brain about this, I thought how hard it must have been for people who were living with the fires at this time. The Thomas Fire was big, but it was just one fire. Here's a list of the 6 separate fires in June 1917. The worst fire was in Ojai, so I'll start there first. The official name for the fire is the Wheeler Springs Matilaha Fire. The fire seems to have been started by a campfire in Wheeler Springs, north of Ojai. And with the high temperature and winds, it quickly spread into the residential area of Ojai, as well as the train station where the telegraph office was. And there used to be a train line that went to Ojai. The old right-of-way for the train is now a bicycle trail. The telegraph operator signaled that the train depot was on fire and he had to leave. The telephone operators also had to leave their building because of the fire. So for a while, Ojai was totally cut off from the rest of the world. And by the way, Ojai's original name was Nordhoff, and the name had only recently been changed to Ojai, so some of the newspapers at that time still referred to the town by its old name. The residential area was hit the hardest. One newspaper wrote, "Today, the burned homes in Ojai outnumber those standing by 2 to 1. From its origin in Matilaha Canyon to the homes of Ojai, the fire advanced under a heavy wind and through brush that had been made tinder dry by a long hot spell." This was a major fire and attracted attention outside our immediate area. The fire made the front page headline in San Bernardino. And the fire was in the headlines up in Sacramento as well. And when I searched for stories about Ojai in the 1917 newspapers available online, I found articles about the fire in the states of Washington, Arizona, Oklahoma, Illinois, Oregon, Colorado, Indiana, Virginia, and New York. The next couple of slides have a lot of text, so I'll read them for you. This is from the Sacramento paper. 2 forest fires ranging in Southern California mountain regions were threatening the destruction of 2 towns, Ojai and Carpinteria, and already had done extensive property damage. Many costly ranch homes and country estates were reportedly destroyed. Several hundred people had been forced to flee from their homes before the fury of the flames, and hundreds of men were fighting valiantly to gain control of the fires. Numerous injuries had been reported, but no known deaths had been recorded. At 10:30 o'clock tonight, telephone advices from Ventura, 15 miles south of Ojai, were to the effect that all communication with Ojai had been cut off, and it was believed the town was burning. The article continued. Hundreds rescued in motors, the fine country estates of a number of wealthy Eastern capitalists, both in the vicinity of Ojai and Carpinteria, had been ravaged by the flames. A special train was sent late tonight from Ventura, carrying firefighters and physicians to the scene of the fire in the Ojai Valley, where it was reported several hundred acres had already been swept by the flames. Several hundred people were rescued by automobile parties sent in by way of Santa Paula, California, through one of the narrow mountain passes leading into the valley. The temperature at Ojai today reached 128 degrees. The Santa Barbara Morning Press wrote about the fire as well. Practically everyone had fled from Ojai at 9 o'clock tonight, except employees of the Ojai State Bank and operators in the telephone office. Hundreds of men were fighting the flames. Just a couple of more stories in the Santa Barbara paper. Several explosions of gasoline were reported to have occurred in Ojai early tonight and added to the spread of flames. The town was practically depopulated, and several hundred refugees were being cared for here, meaning Ventura, and at Santa Paula. And the next one, the fire, it was reported, cut off rescue parties from Ventura, and relief parties were being sent in by way of Santa Paula. Just a couple of more stories in the Santa Barbara paper. Several explosions of gasoline were reported to have occurred in Ojai tonight and added to the spread of the flames. The town was practically depopulated. I think I am repeating myself. Sorry about that. Go on here. The LA Times wrote that the fire had burned about 50 square miles. That's about 32,000 acres. In a blistering heat, with the thermometer said to have reached 130 degrees, refugees in automobiles and wagons and foot poured in one direction and detachments of firefighters in the other. Finally, 3 days later, the fire in Ojai was out. And since the community, like Santa Barbara, is dependent on tourism, they hastened to spread the word that they were rebuilding as quickly as possible. And they would be rebuilding an even better town. Just as Santa Barbara used the 1925 earthquake as a means of rebuilding in the Spanish colonial revival style, Ojai used the opportunity to extend the arcade on the main street. Fortunately, the arcade had survived the fire and had only been built a short time before the fire. The Carpinteria fire. The fire in Carpinteria would have generated plenty of headlines had it not been for the fire in Ojai that was occurring at the same time. The local paper wrote, "There was an abandonment of the homes in the old town of Carpinteria. Many of the wealthier residents of the valley brought their families into the city for the night. For a long time, the situation was about hopeless." At one point, when the fire seemed to threaten downtown Carpinteria, the paper recorded, "Many Carpinteria people spent Saturday night on the beach, convinced that there was every chance for their town to be burned before morning. The residents carried with them to the sands all the household goods they could move. Automobiles, push carts, horse-drawn vehicles, and baskets were used to get furniture, clothing, bedding, and valuables to the beach." It seems that the fire had started in the Toro Canyon area. A number of homes and farms in Carpinteria were destroyed by the flames, but the fire never reached downtown. The Mission Canyon fire. While not as bad as the other fires, it was not far from downtown Santa Barbara and therefore had people very worried for a while. Apparently, the fire started in some grass and rubbish. The flames spread rapidly, and another call was sent in to the firehouse for volunteers to come and fight them. And the emergency call was sounded by the big alarm bell. It was a hard fight, and literally a hot one, for an hour. The hour was a very long one for the forces engaged, but it resulted in the usual victory for the Santa Barbara firemen. The cottage and garage were a total loss. And another fire broke out in Summerland. A blaze sprung up, evidently from a carelessly thrown cigarette on the west side of Ortega Hill. And then talking about the fire chief, it added, "He stopped automobiles on their way to the fire, and soon about 100 men were engaged with shovels, and the fire was extinguished after having covered an area equal to a city block." And then there were more fires in November. Another fire in Ojai destroyed a number of stores in the downtown area. The paper wrote, a message stated that the whole block comprising the business section was gone. The stocks of the various stores were carried into the street. Schoolgirls formed a bucket brigade. Fortunately, most of the newly constructed arcade survived and is still here today. There was also another fire in Mission Canyon in Santa Barbara in November. And if you were around this year, it was a year you would never forget, and one you would tell your grandkids about. There was a second fire in Mission Canyon this month that was more destructive than the one in June. The article continued. Desolation spreads over Upper Mission Canyon today, and the mountain slopes from the base to the high ridges are blackened and scarred. This was the last big fire of 1917. After the fires were history, it was time to reflect on the people who made a difference. There were hundreds of unnamed people to thank. The local paper wrote, the promptness and willingness to serve, which marked the way in which men came forward to fight the fires, was inspiring. They went at their task with a will. After long hours of battle with the flames, they came back bruised and blistered and tired, only to return to the work after a short rest. That was the big thing. They went back. One group of forest fighters was alive because of this man, Jacinto Reyes. A group of men was fighting the fire in thick chaparral when the wind suddenly shifted, sending the flames right toward them. Reyes had a large knife in one hand and an axe in the other, and quickly chopped an exit route for the men. His name lives on in Jacinto Reyes National Scenic Byway and also Reyes Peak, both north of Ojai. There were heroines as well. In Ojai, there were 3 telephone girls who manned the switchboard and stuck to their posts until nearby houses were in flames and it was impossible for anyone to stay in the building. As the Thomas Fire was happening, I kept thinking about how it compared to the fires of a century ago. Rainfall. In 1917, we had had several years of above average rainfall, starting with the record-breaking flood we had in January 1914, when Mission Creek roared like a freight train. In 2017, We had been having several years of drought. Temperature. The summer of 1917 was one of the hottest on record. Temperatures in downtown Santa Barbara for the 3 days leading up to the fire were 105, 105 the next day, and 115 on the third day. Up in the Santa Ynez Mountains, where the fire started, it got up to 128. As I mentioned, people were cooking steaks on hot rocks instead of a barbecue. In 2017, it was a little warmer than usual, but nothing that extreme. Winds. In 1917, it was mentioned that there was a hot wind at the time of the fires. In 2017, we were having Santa Ana winds that start in the desert and blow toward the ocean. And here's a satellite photo of the Thomas Fire showing the winds blowing toward the coast. Causes. The general consensus was that the Ojai fire in June, called the Wheeler Springs Matilla Fire, was caused by a campfire. No one seemed to be sure of the origin of the Carpinteria fire. For the Thomas Fire, I believe power lines being blown in the wind and arcing is blamed for the fire. Duration. The 1917 fires lasted for several days in June and several more in November. The Thomas Fire lasted more than 2 weeks. Acreage. It was estimated that in Ojai, more than 28,000 acres burned, and 20,000 more were burned in the Carpinteria fire. The Thomas Fire burned more than 280,000 acres, about 10 times more than what burned in Ojai. In June 1917, most of the residential area of Ojai burned. Some barns were burned in Carpinteria. In the November 1917 fire, much of the business district of Ojai burned. In the Thomas Fire, more than 1,000 structures burned. We certainly have come a long way in fighting fires in the last century. Number of firefighters. There were some 200 professional firefighters on the 1917 Ojai fire, plus ordinary citizens who fought the fires with shovels and wet sacks. For the Thomas Fire, we had 8,000 firefighters from many of the western states. Fire trucks. Back in 1917, Santa Barbara had 1 fire truck, and Ventura had 1 also. The asterisk is there because the Santa Barbara fire truck was unable to reach Ojai, so only the Ventura truck was able to get there. The road, now called Route 33, was not paved until 1918. On the left is a 1917 La France fire truck. It was equipped with a hose for water and another for chemicals, and that meant mixing acid and baking soda together. For the Thomas Fire, there were 900 plus fire trucks equipped with hoses for water and fire retardant. And this is a scene from the staging area at the Ventura Fairgrounds. I was able to get in because I knew someone on one of the teams there. Aerial assistance. There was nothing available in 1917. The Lockheed brothers were flying their seaplane off the beach at Santa Barbara, but there was no mention of them going near the fires. In 2017, there were 27 helicopters, 6 fixed-wing air tankers, a DC-10, and a 747 that dropped water and retardant on the Thomas Fire. Communication. Back in Santa Barbara in 1917, we had telephones and telegraph, but they were not wireless. So firefighters had to find a home or business that had a telephone in order to make a telephone call. When the telegraph office in the Ojai train station was threatened, the operator left and there was no communication with Ojai. The telephone lines also burned. Nowadays, we have lots of wireless communication. We have cell phones and radio communication. Firefighters can talk to support staff at the base and also communicate with each other on the scene. Equipment that was used to fight the 1917 fires was pretty basic. Fire trucks had hoses, and some private citizens had garden hoses in their yards. Private citizens also used wet sacks and the good old bucket brigade. Shovels and axes were used to create fire breaks. In the Thomas Fire, hoses were used to spray water on the fire and to spray fire retardant in areas that were under threat. Bulldozers created fire breaks, and in some cases, equipment such as chainsaws and axes were used. Amazingly, there were only a few fatalities then and now. 3 women were killed in Ojai, and 1 woman and a firefighter were killed in the 2017 fire. And hopefully someday we'll be able to tell our grandkids, and that was the last big fire in Santa Barbara. This is me and my grandma. Now I want to thank everyone and ask you to stay safe. I'll be ending the show here, and I will be turning it back to get some questions. But I want to tell everyone before I turn off the slideshow here that I was not responsible for the red flag warning that went out to everyone's phone at 3:41 this afternoon.